So I'm not an academic, and I figure my job here is to say something provocative, which probably means it's going to be a big mess. And but I just saw this. I just flew here from Tokyo last night, and I gave a talk in Tokyo, and I'm going to read you exactly the words in English as they were translated, because I think it's sort of like this talk. The future of the book. Try to talk. Do whatever you want. You walk facing up. Yeah. So I don't know, I've been starting off talks for years with this image. It's just so evocative of what is beautiful about where I came from, which is the world of books. So Katerina and I were talking yesterday coming back from the train, and I was asking her about sort of contextualize the meeting for me, and we ended up, I was thinking about the three different sort of takes on the future of reading and writing. And there are those who fear the changes, who just think everything that's happening is scary and not good. There are the techno-optimists who simply assume that all the shiny new things are fantastic and the future is bright. And then there's a new category, or it's not new, but it's come onto my radar, and it's the what me worry crowd, who seem to believe we've entered a parallel universe where nothing ever changes. The heart of this in the United States is data which shows that young people in particular prefer reading on paper to reading on screens. And the entire publishing industry in the United States keeps breathing these huge sighs of relief that, oh, the book industry is going to stay the same. We're going to be able to keep doing what we've been doing for the last several hundred years. And they're not right about this, but they think they are, which is kind of interesting. So what I'm going to try to do in the course of this talk is to show that none of these three are right. The future isn't terrible. The future isn't, it might be terrible, actually. The future isn't necessarily bright, and it certainly isn't going to stay the same. So when I was growing up, we really knew what a book was. It was this object with a bunch of pages bound with a cover, and you stuck your nose in it all by yourself and parked yourself on a chair or under a tree. It was really simple. But then, whoops, oh, I hate PowerPoint. There are a few different things I saw around this time, all of which completely changed my mind about things, but this is as good a way of any to start. This was done at MIT in the late 70s in Nicholas Negroponte's Architecture Machine Group lab. And I was there, and I got to see this and you'll see why it blew my mind.
I can get a definition of these words just by touching them, and the definition will appear in the illustration corner.
Now, one thing you should understand, by the way, is that in 1979, if I don't show you anything else in this video, what you see on the screen right now was absolutely mind-blowing, because up until this moment, the only time we'd ever seen text on a screen, it was always that reversed out, horrible green on black or maybe gray on black. But it never looked like a page with dark type on a white page. And the resolution in this image is terrible, but that has much more to do with the camera than with the actual type. It was very crisp. They had just invented anti-alias type at MIT, so that the text did look perfectly clear on the screen.
I can get back to the illustration, but in this case it's not a single frame, but it's actually a movie of someone coming into the frame and doing the repair that's described.
So my heart skipped a beat when I saw that, because up until that moment, pages in my life had always stayed the same. They didn't actually change at any given moment. As soon as you saw it, you saw it. But suddenly I understood that you could expand the notion of a page to include other things besides print and pictures, text and pictures. So around this same time that multimedia was being sort of explored and discovered, there was a lot of discussion about hypertext. And I'm going to play you two very short clips, and I apologize. These are from some horrible American history television program, and the music is quite horrid. But the points they make are good.
Belgian Paul Odelay believed that world peace could be achieved through a global sharing of knowledge. He and Henri Lafontaine began summarizing information, classifying and cross-referencing it in a world palace of knowledge that ultimately held 15 million entries on cards and microfilm. When people sent questions, Odelay's staff searched the archive, retrieved information, provided query results, and most significantly, suggested cross-referenced or linked data, much like a search engine does today.
If you go to Brussels, by the way, you can go to Odelay Street, because they've named a street after him, which is about all that's left of his ideas, unfortunately. That was in quite a bit earlier, but then post-World War America, Vannevar Bush comes along.
At the end of World War II, American scientist and engineer Vannevar Bush published his concept for the Memex, a device to augment human memory and index information. He believed people could navigate information quickly if the process of cross-referencing was automated. The most essential feature, Bush wrote, was the process of tying two items together. Information would not be organized by traditional categories, but by free association, one of the ways the brain links information.
So at that point, and I'll say I, but what I really mean is a whole bunch of us, I think around the world, we're all sort of dancing around these problems at the same time. So we have multimedia, the possibility of multimedia on the one hand, slightly interactive multimedia, and on the other hand, this idea of all the world's information being searchable and accessible at the user's in a way that the structure of the way it is returned is useful to the user, to the reader. So I didn't know anything any better, so I actually figured I'd go make a new kind of encyclopedia. And these next three slides are pictures that I commissioned in 1981, maybe 1982, probably 1981. By a Disney animator, Glenn Keane, and we came up with a bunch of scenarios for what the encyclopedia of the future would be like. And what you see here is a bunch of kids walking around a museum with handheld terminals, with headphones, and what they're doing is they're asking questions about what they see. And the kids looking up against the wall, those are screens, and they're able to query the screen, which also gives them sort of extensive captions and information. This is a father giving his son the big picture in the middle is a screen. He's giving his son a tour of 1960s rock and roll. But again, drawing on contents that are in the encyclopedia that he's drawing out and presenting in the way that he wants to present it to his son. And this last one, it's a mother and her two children at a tide pool in Southern California, and they're looking into the tide pool, and they've got a little camera on there, and they're taking pictures, and they're asking basically, what is it that we're looking at? One of the things I'm most proud of in these pictures, if you'll notice on the device she's got, there's a little antenna. Because in 1982, way before it was actually possible, we were assuming that these things would be wireless and you would be connected. Now, one thing that's interesting, which you should sort of keep in mind for later, is that all of these pictures at this point, and not just the pictures, but our heads, all we could see was that all the world's information was going to be somewhere in this huge archive, and we were going to have access to it. It never occurred to us that there was going to be something more important about the network than that it would feed us information. And we'll get to that in a bit. But at that time, we just saw the network as something that was a mechanism for getting from the repository of information out to the user. And honestly, actually, I should tell you this. When I say that that's the case of I thought that, people who were building the beginnings of the internet in 1980, they were way beyond where I was. They had already understood that the internet was about putting people together, not simply about getting information. Whoops. Come on. Okay. So I started doing stuff. And I'm going to run you through this. I think because the trajectory of the work my colleagues and I did is a good sort of base to think about all the possible futures that we might be going into. So in 1984, you had a choice. You could make things for the computer, but the computer was still basically it was very low resolution. And I don't know if anybody here remember or ever saw their parents' Apple II, but it was, it was a horrible black screen with horrible pea green type on it. And if there were drawings, they were very simple, very, very simple line drawings. Or you could work with video. And I came out of the book world where I was used to high resolution and beautiful aesthetics, and we just couldn't do that on a computer, but we could do it in video. So I started basically releasing films with supplementary sections and commentary tracks.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ronald Haver, and I'm here to do something which we feel is rather unique. I'm going to take you on a lecture tour of King Kong as you watch the film. The Laserdisc technology offers us this opportunity, and we feel it's rather unique, the ability to switch back and forth between the soundtrack and this lecture.
So this idea of layering, where you could have a movie or any piece of art, and that you could add layers to it to enable people to understand more about it, was something that was always in the mix from the beginning. And then we sort of went down the bandwidth curve. So we started with video because you could do it. And then a few years later, Apple made it possible to connect a CD drive to a computer, and then we could start working with audio. And so this is from 1980, I think we came out in 89, but we actually made this in 88. It was sort of the first CD-ROM. I should tell you, because this was made, at that time, the computer screen on the Macintosh was 640 by 480. And it was just black and white. There wasn't any grayscale. So the reason why this looks the way it does is because this was the state of the art at that moment.
The first of Voyager's award-winning CD companions, Beethoven Symphony No. 9, completely changed the way people think about interactive media.
So we broke the symphony up into chapters.
Combining a masterful recording by the Vienna Philharmonic with expert commentary by UCLA professor Robert Winter, this program lets you explore Beethoven's masterpiece at your own pace. Beethoven's World examines the tumultuous life of the composer. It includes a detailed look at the musical development of the Ninth Symphony. The art of
That was the best the computer could do then.
from the Ninth Symphony to explain musical concepts. Both novice and seasoned listeners will appreciate Beethoven in entirely new ways. The program also includes the full text of Schiller's Ode to Joy in both English and German. When you're finished with the program, test your knowledge of Beethoven with a question and answer game for up to 4 players.
Sehr gut.
And then, continuing to go down the bandwidth curve, in '92, Apple sent us a prototype for the first PowerBook. And a friend of mine who was visiting from the Austrian National Library in Vienna, he ripped it out of my hands when it came. We opened the box, he ripped it out of my hands and came back about half an hour later. He had put the first 10 pages of Paul Bowles' Sheltering Sky into a hypercard stack. And we looked at it and we said to each other, oh, now we can do it. Now an electronic book is actually imaginable. And we did, the first 3 were Jurassic Park before it came out in paperback, Martin Gardner's Annotated Alice, and Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Trilogy. And they came on floppy disks, and in terms of functionality, there are a couple of things that Kindle still doesn't do, and very few that it does that we didn't do back in '92. And I came across this. This is just for fun. This is a video that somebody found an old PowerBook and made a little video of the first expanded book.
This is the famous opening line from Neuromancer. The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. And I can continue reading from there and arrow my way through the book.
As Katerina said in her introduction, it was too early, but I will tell you that it was revelatory. I remember the very first time I was on an airplane from New York to Los Angeles, and I was reading a picture of Dorian Gray, and I had a drink in one hand, and my legs were crossed, and the device was sitting on the little tray, and I was reading, and I went, oh my God, for the first time in my life, I'm reading without holding the book. And for a couple of years after that, John Sculley, who was the head of Apple, that was before Steve Jobs came back, Sculley used to fly me around the world so that I could lie down on stages and show people how I could read a book with one in bed without having to hold on to it. With a hardback book, you need 3 hands really to read it. You need 2 to hold it and 1 to turn the pages. So with this thing, I could lie down on the stage, I could lean it up against my knee, and to turn pages, all I had to do was do this. You'll like this story. So we were at some trade show, and this guy comes up to us and he says, my wife never, ever, ever, ever was interested in computers until she saw me reading in bed one night, and she insisted that I go out and get her a computer. And so then he painted this picture for us of the two of them lying in bed, both of them with the computers sitting on their chests, going like this to turn the pages. So the words that go with this slide is, and then came the internet. This is actually, this slide is from, this picture is from 1968, I think, maybe 67, maybe 64, in there. And it is the first 4 nodes of the internet. Utah, Stanford Research Institute, University of California, Santa Barbara, and UCLA. And what's significant about this is there's no question when you read the literature and talk to the people who were involved that 100% of their purpose was putting people together. They were building a network to enable collaboration. That was the point of what they were doing. The problem for me was that I had basically, as a publisher, built a career making objects. There we go. Now we won't trip. Making objects that had to be sold in stores mostly, because we didn't have Amazon back then for shipping to you overnight. But suddenly the internet came along and people were getting maybe not the same kind of product out of the internet, but they were getting enough that was tremendously valuable to them, so that the idea of spending $20, $30, $40 on a digital object just didn't make sense. And there were no stores that sold them anyway. We sold them through bookstores, but the bookstores had no mechanism for browsing. So if you didn't know that you wanted the CD companion to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, there was no way, like with a book, where you could open it up and see whether you might want it. So the internet came along and just blew us out of the water. There was no longer any market for digital objects. So I basically started making tools because that seemed like a good thing to do. And then the MacArthur Foundation came to me one day, called me up on the phone, and they said, "We really liked it when you were a publisher. Couldn't you go back to publishing?" And I told them I didn't know what it meant to be a publisher anymore, but I'd be happy to think about it if they gave me some money. And they gave me so much money, more than I asked for, way more than I asked for. And so I took the money and I hired 4 young people just out of university, and just out of university in the humanities. I think all of them had degrees in literature. And we sat around a table for a year and just talked to each other about what is the future of the book. And it was a sweet collaboration because they respected what I had done, but not so much that they were in awe of it or of me. And they were coming of age as Web 2.0, the social web, was coming of age. And basically, they pushed in that direction. And the breakthrough for us was, we're having lunch one day with Mackenzie Wark, and Ken had written this book that had gotten fairly famous in the States among a certain strata called Hacker Manifesto. And he was telling us about his new book, which he said was going to be the first very serious critical theory of video games. And so I asked him, could we, before he got a publisher, Harvard eventually published it, but before he got a publisher, could we play around with it? And he said yes. And it led to one of those fantastic unintended consequences, completely accidental changing of sort of my little world. The problem we were dealing with was that Ken doesn't write in ordinary expository texts. What he would do is he would have a section, and a section would have 5 paragraphs. And let me actually get up the electronic version of this. And we had a problem. Let me see if I can make this work. Yeah. All we were doing was hacking WordPress. And we were intending to put the text and put the conversation below. Because what we were experimenting with was what eventually became called social reading. We wanted to see what happened when you put people into the mix. But because of the way Ken wrote, if we had put the comments below the chapter, below the paragraphs, you wouldn't know which paragraph the comment referred to. So my colleagues came up, I had nothing to do with this. My colleagues came up with the idea of moving the comments from down below, moving them up next to the text, so that when you change paragraph, you change comments. And within about an hour of this going online, thanks to it being mentioned in Boing Boing, a conversation started to emerge in the margin. And it was fantastic, because what you saw at the very beginning, Ken was a control freak. And anytime somebody would write something, he would answer it. But if you watch the flow of the conversation, you realize that over the course of several days, he starts to trust the readers. And he starts to become a really good professor in a seminar where he might know more than everybody else, and maybe he set the terms of the discussion, but it's clear that they're working collaboratively to understand things as deeply as they can. And although I had nothing to do with this design, I think I was sort of the first one to get goosebumps when I realized what we had done, which was completely unintentionally, we had flattened the hierarchy of print, okay, where, not all the way, but we made it much flatter, where, you know, the author up there and the reader down there, we had sort of put them into the same space. And that actually turned out, made a huge amount of difference. And we started getting, there was a front page article in the big education journal in the States, the Chronicle of Higher Education. And we started getting requests from professors who would say, I want to do this, but I want to use it with regular text, quote. And so we made something called Comment Press, which I'm embarrassed to say still exists. But it was a way for people to start to experiment with social reading. Let me see if I can go back to, come on, you can do it. That's not the right one. Delete that. That's the right one. Okay. And the next, well, actually, this was the last project we did in this, last experiment we did with social reading at the Institute. And it was one of those wonderful sort of accidents of history. I don't usually reread books, but I was rereading Doris Lessing's Golden Notebook, because it was a very important book for me when I was growing up. And I realized that none of my young colleagues, even the one with her double firsts from Oxford in literature, had read the book. And I was thinking, wow, it would be so interesting if somebody in my generation who read the book in the 60s could read it again with much younger people. I'd love to see the discussion that takes place. So we got the British Arts Council to give us a little bit of money, and we got Doris Lessing to, then she wins the Nobel Prize. So then it becomes something we had to do. And so we got permission to do this, and I recruited these 7 people to read it, ranging in age from basically my age down in their 20s. And so this was, you could comment on the page, not on a specific, not on a string of text, but this is the conversation that took place on one page of the book. And it was fantastic, you know, to see these 7 women, because they read it together. They were spread out over 9 time zones, and they read it together over 6 weeks. And it was fantastic to see them struggling to understand the text across generations. I will also say that they basically all hated the book, which was shocking to me. I'm afraid that if I keep this up forever, every time people search the Golden Notebook forever, they're going to come across this first. And I'm not sure I want this to be the remembrance of this book, but such is life. Okay. There it is, okay. So after all these experiments, God, we're losing a whole lot over there. After these experiments, I decided it was, well, actually, I decided social reading was so much more significant than adding audio and video to a page. Multimedia is cool, it's wonderful. We're going to keep working on it as all of us. But it turned out that putting people on the page was so much more interesting, and there was so much more to learn. And so we started to build a platform for social reading, and called Social Book. And yes, I'll log in. So, oh, this is terrible. It's cutting off the most important stuff. Oh well. So let me open up one of these. Oh, that's really unfortunate. Anyway, there are a lot of social reading schemes at this point. I don't like pretty much any of the others yet except ours. And the reason is because, and it's what you can't see here, if this were properly displayed, the right-hand column, which is the comments, would go out almost as wide as the text itself. Because, and this is really to me fundamental, the way we look at the commentary is that it is not, it's not an add-on. It is actually increasingly going to become an intrinsic, inherent part of the text. And in order for that to happen, it has to breathe, and it has to be displayed in a way that makes it nice to read. It can't be in little sort of pop-up post-its that come up all over the page and are confusing, or even worse, sometimes they come up over the text itself. The other thing that's important about this particular structure is the left-hand column, and those are the people in the group I'm reading with. It's important to know who's in the conversation with you. Every teacher who's used this has said pretty much the same thing, which is that it changes the nature of what happens in the classroom. They say the kids come to class having read the material and having talked about it, so that the conversation kind of starts ahead of where it ever used to end up. That's the good news. The bad news is that it turns out that our modern day syllabi are not well structured for this kind of reading. Because, I'm not sure about Germany, but in the United States, in a literature class, you might be expected to read a novel every week or every 10 days, which students probably don't do anyway, but they absolutely can't do it like this. And the problem here is that if you haven't read the text and made comments in the margin, everybody knows you haven't done your homework. So when people try to do their homework and they immediately start screaming to the teacher, no, you can't come close to asking us to do this much work. And then the other side of that equation is the teachers don't necessarily want to do that much work because they don't want to work that hard. So it's very clear to me that truly collaborative learning requires a complete rethink of the way the courses are structured. I wanted to show one more of these pieces. I think it's mostly because of where I came from sort of coming from this idea of multimedia being important. It never occurred to me when we made Social Book that it wouldn't work as well with a movie as it would with a novel. So, so we did it. We made it work that way. This is a full-length feature film. And at any point in the time code, I could enter a comment here. And we see people having the same very complex, threaded conversations in the margin of a film that they have in the margin of a novel or an essay. It works. I mean, basically what I will say is that I think that all media consumption is going to go social eventually. You know, I don't want to put a time on that. Although I will tell you that in the United States, when Twitter came along and became popular, real-time television watching increased by 20%. Because people wanted to be in contact with their friends while they were watching the same programs. Really interestingly, there was a television program in the States called Breaking Bad, which I imagine made it here to Germany. And the producer, the creator of it, said that the reason why it survived was because of Pirate Bay. That nobody watched it at the beginning, but it was downloaded and pirated so much and people started sharing it that the audience started to build, and that because of that they got to do more seasons. It became so popular that on the last episode, instead of showing it in the Eastern time zone, the Midwest time zone, and the Mountain time zone, and then California, they had to show it in all the time zones simultaneously, so that people could communicate with each other online while they were watching it. Where are we here? So I used to say that, until maybe yesterday, that we were going back to the future. I had an opportunity a bunch of years ago to visit the Medici Library, basically, in Florence. And they went and they grabbed a bunch of books from the back room, books before the era of print. And one of the things fantastic about these books, of course, were these huge margins. Because, and I didn't understand this at the time, until they explained it to me, that these books were, from their very conception, they were social. The monk, who was the teacher, would go get a book, probably unchain it from where it's chained, bring it to a table, and he and the students would stand around the book, and the book was simply a mnemonic device. The purpose of the book was to be a jumping off place for the conversation. And the conversation would be recorded in the margin as they were speaking. And it's wonderful to see all these different handwritings in the margin of these books. And so I have enjoyed saying that we're simply going back to the future, where reading has always been social, except for the last maybe 150, 200 years, where it has been something that we think of as something you do by yourself. I mean, 200 years ago, people, if they had a book, they would read out loud. It was a social experience. And if you think about it, we can go all the way back to sitting around that campfire where humans are discussing whatever problems once they have language, whatever problems they have. And somewhere along the way, somebody invents a mechanism for writing and for transmitting ideas across time and space. And eventually, you know, we start to have writers and we have readers, and then we have print, which does a fantastic job of moving these ideas across time and space. But what happened when we reified the contents of a conversation into a book, we lost sight of the social aspect of it. I mean, think about it. Pretend this is a book for a minute. So to produce this book, I do a lot of reading, and I do a lot of talking to colleagues and going to conferences and essays and everything else. And all of that gets put into this book. And if the book is any good at all, people talk about it afterwards. And that happens outside the book. In a lot of ways, I think what we're working towards is redrawing the boundary of the book to include everything that happened before and everything that happened afterwards. I gave a talk a bunch of years ago to a group of biographers, and I figured I'd try something, and I said, so imagine that instead, because one of the people in the room was one of these guys who gets millions of dollars to go away for 10 years and write a big biography about a big person. And I said to him, so suppose your publisher said to you, okay, we're going to give you the same amount of money over time. Don't worry about that, but we want you to work differently. Instead of going away for 10 years, we're going to set you up with a blog, and every day, every other day, whatever it is, you know, we want you to sort of summarize what you're reading, what you're thinking about, and we're going to have people subscribe to your effort. And you're going to have thousands of people who are going to be reading your blog and are going to be participating. They're going to be telling you what they think. They're going to be sending you ideas. They're going to be raising difficult questions for you. And in the end, you'll still have a book, but it's going to be a much better book. And would you do that? And I knew the answer was, and he went like that. And I said, I get it. You know, this works for you. You've got this down pat. I said, but I guarantee you, there's some young woman who's getting her PhD in history right now at Yale, who grew up in MySpace and Facebook and Snapchat and everything else, and she is absolutely comfortable being public, thinking out loud, and working in this way. And we're going to get there. And I believe that. So suppose this is 1494, 40 years after Gutenberg perfects the printing press. And so imagine we're only 40 years into the transformation into the digital era. So here are a couple of factoids. Page numbers were just invented, right? It took about a couple more than 40 years for page numbers to start to appear in texts. It isn't till 1605, okay, 151 or 40, whatever it is, years after the perfection of the printing press, that we get the first novel that Cervantes publishes, Don Quixote. It takes humans a hugely long time to figure out what to do with new technologies in terms of expressive forms. It's not that we don't have experiments. We have experiments from day one. But to get to the point where you actually have something that sticks, something that people go, oh, that's actually going to hang on here, that actually takes time. And I think that we are so early in this transitional era. Basically, I want to put this in a way that isn't off-putting. I think that those of us who focus on the book might be in one of those evolutionary dead ends. Not because our goals aren't honorable, but because we're not understanding that as the mode of expression changes, everything else is going to change. And there's no reason why a printed object should be, for all time, the main way that humans communicate big ideas. I gave a talk, one of the talks I gave in Tokyo, it was one of these horrible, nostalgic, look backward talks. And where was I going with that? Hold on. Oh, I know. If I'd been 15 years younger, I'm pretty sure I would have gone to the game world, right? But I wasn't. I was a child of the book. And for me, the book was the gold standard. It was everything. And all I wanted to do was make a better book. And I think, and that's in fact why I went down the bandwidth curve. For me, I was heading towards where I wanted to go in the first place. I would have made an interactive book first if the technology had been there. But instead, I had to start with video and go to music and then go to the book. In fact, I realized that if I had been a little bit younger and had gone into the game world, I would have started much lower, but I could have just kept going up the curve instead of having to go down. And I know up and down are complicated, and I don't want to make it sound like it's that simple. It isn't, but I think it's worth thinking about. And this is an example. There's a writer in the States, many of you may have heard of him, named Cory Doctorow. And this is something Cory and I have argued about in the past. This is a screen from World of Warcraft. And I've argued for a long time that this is a form of fiction. You could think of this as a future book. And if you're not familiar with World of Warcraft, it's this game that for many, many years was sort of the #1 game, and there were 10 million subscribers paying $15 a month to play this game. And it's basically where you get yourself into a group, a guild, and you go around collecting and smashing and doing things people do in games. But what was significant about this was that people were playing this game 30, 40 hours a week. And what were they doing most of that time? They were chatting with each other. World of Warcraft was a place where somebody had the ability to describe a world that readers occupied and made up the narrative as they went. And that was, I find that incredibly compelling, and it seems to me it's going to be fundamental to the future, that whether it is nonfiction or fiction, they're going to be, a book is going to be a place that we occupy and where we are active participants. This is a quote, I'm going to read it slowly from McLuhan. Primitive and pre-alphabet people integrate time and space as one and live in an acoustic, horizonless, boundless olfactory space rather than in visual space. Their graphic presentation is like an X-ray. They put in everything they know rather than only what they see. A drawing of a man hunting seal on an ice floe will show not only what is on top of the ice, but what lies underneath as well. As Naomi Barron pointed out to me earlier, they are still putting forth a visual representation, but the point is that their knowledge of their world is deeper than simply what they can see at any given moment, and when they represent it, they want to represent everything they know, which includes much of what can't be seen at a given moment. So I read that, and then it made me want to show you this. This is a video that I think Google just put up of somebody in virtual reality. Whoops. Oh, I wanted to. So, I mean, let me go to the end of this. I want to. Anyway. The point of showing that is, to me, I see that future art is going to be much more complex than present art. And I don't mean the ideas, because there's nothing more complicated than, you know, the ideas in a great novel. I'm talking about the actual structure of the information. You know, if you can imagine an artist being able to create a three-dimensional world, and for the readers, not just to explore that world by themselves, but to explore it with other people, and if you bring in the whole concept of fan fiction or reader participation, you start to imagine sort of seeds where, you know, an artist will create a seed, and that seed will just grow and grow and grow if it's any good. And the possibilities become so endless and impossible for us to imagine. And I think that's sort of a very important part of the equation here, is how impossible it is for us who grew up in this very print-centric world to imagine what's going to happen over the next 150 years. That's not that's not a weakness of ours. It's just a truth about what it means to be a human. And I think that one of the problems, and McLuhan sort of is the genius that's sort of pointing at this, is our time scale is problematic. We always want to think that the big thing is going to happen on our watch, right? That the future is going to come now, or at least while we're alive. And that might not be the case, but it makes it very difficult for us to sort of walk far enough up the mountain to really have a big enough picture of how things are going to develop. And I'm just about done. So there's another McLuhan quote. "The medium or process of our time, electric technology, is reshaping and restructuring patterns of social interdependence and every aspect of our personal life. It is forcing us to reconsider and reevaluate practically every thought, every action, and every institution formerly taken for granted. Everything is changing. You, your family, your education, your neighborhood, your job, your government, your relationship to the others, and they're changing dramatically." He wrote that in 1967, 49 years ago. But it's that sort of complexity that we're heading into, where everything we take for granted is changing. Remember in 1454, we didn't have nation states, we didn't have capitalism, we didn't even have the sense we have today of what an individual is. Okay, our understanding today of what a human is did not exist really before the printing press. And if you think of all those things I just mentioned that didn't exist before the printing press, try to figure out what the analog is of all those things going forward and how profoundly things are going to change. And as we talk about reading and writing, I think what we're talking about is human communication and how it's changing, and we can't imagine. But here's the issue. Remember I told you that one of the three groups I talked about at the beginning was sort of the what me worry group of nothing is changing? So I loved walking around Goettingen this morning where I saw things like a store selling writing instruments with an entire window devoted to fountain pens. It's great. Or this bookstore. Now, I can find a bookstore like that in New York, but I can't find many. And I can find a few of them here in this town. So here's the thing. I think this is I don't live here, but it looks to me like this is a fantastic place for a human to live. It looks to me like it is human-centric. But the thing is, the goal is not to freeze this so that we're still selling pens or have bookstores but not anything that's electronic. The point is to take what's good about living in a town like this and figure out how do we take what we value as good and bring it into the new era with us. More McLuhan. Had the schoolmen with their complex oral culture understood the Gutenberg technology, they could have created a new synthesis of written and oral education, instead of bowing out of the picture and allowing the merely visual page to take over the educational enterprise. The oral schoolmen did not meet the new visual challenge of print, and the resulting expansion or explosion of Gutenberg technology was in many respects an impoverishment of the culture. The point of reading this quote from McLuhan, and especially tied back to talking about where we are right now, is that those of us who have had the privilege of growing up in places like this or in this era, and that to the extent that we can, it's our job to figure out how to get involved with the development of the new technologies in such a way that it preserves the best of what we know to be humanity is, and not to abstract ourselves from the process. And as I think I did when I sort of put aside games, you know, the electronic games as those are toys, and I didn't get involved there. And in retrospect, I wish I had. Okay, I wish I had brought my book mind to the game world. And I think that in a lot of ways, that is really the challenge, is for us to bring our concerns for the future of reading and writing, to bring those out of the book world and into the new world that's being born, whether it is in the shape of a book or not. And then lastly, again, McLuhan, and I came to McLuhan very late in life. As I said in Tokyo, there were 3 M's that were important to me. One was Malcolm X, one was Mao Zedong, and that's when I was young. And then probably only about 10 years ago, I started reading McLuhan. But he says, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there is a willingness to contemplate what is happening. Hugely important concept, I think, for people like us who are trying as hard as we can to invent the future. Okay, it really is up to us, and as long as we're willing to open our eyes wide and see what's happening, then we can possibly have a good effect. Onward. Thank you.